Welcome. This is Katrina VanHuss, and we are here talking today with Danielle Dodman, National Muscle Walk Director at MDA, Otis Fulton, our psychologist, and we also have a guest appearance by Becky Lunders. Okay, so Danielle Dodman, I am going to introduce you, and hopefully you will not have feedback, and we are going to continue to work on it while you talk. Before we get started, get a little bit of information from the audience. And that is about what we're going to do today. So right now, you have a poll on the right side, and what we want you to do is go ahead and answer that in about the next 20 seconds. If you guys could vote on what your situation is. And then we're going to immediately publish what you said back to the group. About half the folks have voted. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and tell you guys what you look like as an audience. We've got 75% of the people who have voted now. All right, and that's what we look like. 65% of our group would actually rely on a volunteer committee to help make goal. So now we're going to see what we look like in a different regard. If you could answer that poll, and we'll just take a few seconds to do this. This is Katrina, by the way. I don't know how the feedback went away, but thank you, Ted, who's my marketing manager in the room with me. All right, we've got 24% of folks have voted. And as people enter the webinar, we're just going to spend a little time and understand what we look like as a group. All right, and I'm going to close this one. We've got 88% of the folks who have voted. And now this is what we look like. So 73% of us would recruit volunteers and 27% would accept it. It's not perfect. We're going to hit one more poll. And if you vote one more time. You guys are good at this. I'm impressed. All right, we've got 83% of the people voted, 85%, and this is what we look like. Well done. So Danielle, this is our crowd. This is pretty exciting. So
I'm pretty excited by the results.
Yes, absolutely. So what we're going to do right now is have Danielle talk a little bit about her experience at the American Cancer Society Relay for Life. We're going to talk about the history of the income that they've experienced and its relationship to volunteerism. So Danielle, take it off. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself before you get into the relay story, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone, and great to be with all of you today. I started my career with the American Cancer Society in 2000 and was fortunate to work on the ACS mission for almost 14 years. And the Relay family is truly a family, I can tell you that. But I made the decision to stay within the nonprofit when I decided to leave the American Cancer Society. I wanted to stay in nonprofit and really go to another nonprofit that was devoted to a very strong mission center and community focused, and that was really important to me, and that's what really led me to start the next chapter of my career with MDA. And then their mission is exciting because it's so family based, and really that's how my career started with the American Cancer Society. So I'm fortunate to kind of continue that career path with that feeling of making a difference locally. So a little bit about the American Cancer Society Relay for Life. When Relay started, it started in 1985, and it actually started because of one volunteer. His name was Dr. Gordy Klatt, and he was passionate about doing something to honor his patients that were impacted by a cancer diagnosis. So he decided to walk or run for 24 hours straight. And not everyone would kind of take on that challenge, but for him, that's what he wanted to do, to raise awareness and raise funds. And in his first year, he raised about $27,000 just by asking his family, friends, colleagues, whoever he came across, to support him for his efforts through a pledge. And really, that's how the first step started, which was him taking those initial steps. The next year, he said, I can't do this by myself, and he invited others to join him, to walk around the track overnight, because in his mind and in the teams that were joining him, cancer didn't sleep, so for one night, neither would they. And he was joined by about 19 teams that second year, and they raised about $33,000. From that point forward, the RFL movement was born, and it really has grown beyond its roots in Tacoma, Washington, to include over 5,000 communities and over 20 countries globally. But it was started by one man's vision of what he could do to impact the disease of cancer. So far, Relay for Life has raised over $5 billion over the last 30 years, and I don't know about you, but I think that's an amazing number and accomplishment. And so, you know, you think about his vision and what he would accomplish that first year. Did he ever think that it would culminate in such a big number? But after the movement started, you know, and other communities started joining in across the country, a local community had a little bit of trouble. They forgot to request to turn on the lights overnight. So they were faced with, what if the event is completely dark? So the volunteers got together and they said, you know what, we've got a solution. We're just going to put bags around the track. We're going to light those candles, and that'll light our way throughout the night. And the next year they said, you know what, let's bring it back, and that'll be our way to honor our folks that have been touched by cancer or that we've lost to cancer. And the concept of Luminaria was born. And now it's another important income stream for Relay for Life. And what's great about that is that's the second piece of that volunteer story, is that a volunteer was faced with a problem and they came up with a solution because they were empowered to make that decision. So what's really interesting is that this grassroots initiative of volunteers working to further the American Cancer Society's mission has always been at the organization's core. However, with Relay, it takes on a whole different vibe. So this picture cracks me up, because the gentleman that you see on the screen is exactly the volunteer persona. And what makes me funny is, what makes it really funny is that these volunteers become so passionate about the color purple and what their mission is with Relay that it's really contagious. And so there's not too many spots where you would see a gentleman dress up in this goofy attire and just have a great time while volunteering and making such a difference. So why are they successful? Why is Relay for Life successful when it comes to creating a volunteer experience? There's a few things. Relay for Life is about having fun as a volunteer. Although the mission is serious, they have fun while they work, so it doesn't feel like work. At meetings, you can see volunteers and staff alike dressing up. They wear lots of beads and lights, as you can see in the picture. They have an opportunity to tap into their silly side by dancing, laughing, and lots of hugging, whether they know you or not. The volunteers love to hug, and so do the staff. It's really a contagious feeling to be in a room surrounded by volunteers that are committed to the fight against cancer, and it's a part of a group that you want to be a part of, and I think that's what attracts new volunteers into the Relay mission. The second key is that ACS invests in Relay volunteers through training opportunities at the local, the regional, the divisional, and national levels. The training opportunities, they include peer-to-peer success stories, new initiatives, inspiring mission stories, and an atmosphere that's motivating and hopeful. Volunteers leave excited and always leave with new friends that feel a little like family by the end of the weekend. And I think that's one of the keys when you talk to that volunteer experience, is that the organization invests in those volunteers to further the mission. The third thing is that volunteers openly share their ideas. Everyone has an opportunity to contribute to the organization's success. And so really when you think about why Relay has really started in Tacoma, Washington and spread so fast amongst the volunteer life is that there is a we mentality when it comes to Relay volunteers. They succeed together. And so they're cheering each other on. They're sharing their ideas of what works because everyone wants everybody to be better and better to make a further impact on the mission. And that's what's so exciting is they really work in conjunction with each other no matter where they live. So, and the organization helps foster that, and I think that's a really key piece. The last thing is that Relay volunteers are passionate about fighting back and telling their story. The Relay volunteers, as you saw in the previous picture, he bleeds purple. The majority of volunteers, they bleed purple because they're so passionate about telling their story and really empowering people to be a part of making a difference. And that is what I think has really culminated into the success of that volunteer movement through Relay. And I think it's something that we as other organizations can really learn from because each of us have the ability to use those 4 keys for our future success. So the other piece that's really important to the Relay volunteers is the recognition and promotion of volunteers. And so what that means is spending the time to really appreciate the local committee members, the team captains and participants, and really recognize what they do on a daily basis to contribute to that overall fundraising total and also their commitment on their time, because that is what helps the organization move forward faster, is the volunteer piece. The second thing is that the events and trainings, the focus of recognition is on the volunteers and their accomplishments. Again, they are representative of what's being accomplished in the community, and therefore the recognition is really directed to those individuals that are making it happen on the volunteer leadership front. And then last thing is at the actual events, one of the things that you'll constantly see at a Relay is the volunteers are the ones on stage. They're the ones that are doing the messaging. They're the ones that really are doing that recognition piece of the local teams and participants. And that's so important because they are really the local community that are making those events possible. Katrina, I'll turn it back to you for a minute.
All right, so anxiously, of course, I want to do another poll because they're really fun. We're closing in on the science part of this, and if you guys could answer this poll, this will give us a good feel of where the audience is. Got about 2% have voted right now. 23%, 50%, 70%. All right, we're at about 80% now. So I'm going to close the poll and share it with you. So as you can see, 32% of you have no volunteers on a leadership committee. Or I'm sorry, this is, my question was setting the income goal. I apologize. This is 0, or 32% have 0 volunteer input on setting the income goal. So I'll turn it back to you, Danielle.
So I think in terms of setting the income goal, and you'll see based on this, the org chart that we're going to talk about now, it's so important to have that buy-in on the volunteer level that they want to accomplish the same thing. And I can tell you, in working with volunteers, 9 times out of 10, their number is usually higher than what we would set as staff. They see that much potential in their community to kind of raise the bar. So there's definitely an important piece of that, and I know, Relay has definitely made that transition, and they're starting to see the benefits in so many more communities because of that. But in terms of executing the volunteer-driven events, I draw attention to the org chart on the screen, and so you'll see it's pretty simplified in nature. You have part of the chart that focuses on income, meaning sponsorship and teams and participants, and then online fundraising. Then you have part of the chart that really focuses on that day of event experience, and so it really allows the event chairperson to work with other event leaders to execute a well-rounded and full event that's going to make its income goals because there's a complete committee. But something I think you want to draw attention to is that staff piece, because if you were left all of these things just up to one staff person, it's a good way to burn a staff person out because that's a lot of responsibility. And you're not just staffing one event usually. So when you look at utilizing your resources, the staff person is listed off to the side, and it's listed as a staff resource, but really I think they're the GPS. You consider the event chairperson your driver. They drive things in the community because they have so many local contacts and they have a lot of local relationships. But the staff person is really the GPS because we're spending a lot of time internally training that person. You know, we're giving them resources and everything else. And it's up to that staff person to really provide the guidance for that chairperson to really hit their goals and keep their committee on track to meet whatever the goals are for the event. And so that staff person plays that critical role of the GPS, not the GPS that turns you in circles, by the way. It's the one that keeps you and gets you to the right destination on the first time. And so they work in concert with that event chairperson to make sure that you've got a full committee, that the committee is really contributing in all cylinders when it comes to their respective roles, and really making sure that they stay in tune with what we need to accomplish for the year. And you'll see it doesn't have to be complicated for it to work. People join committees because they're asked and they want to do more for the organization. I think that's a really key piece. The second key piece, and then probably the second most important to this, is not only just having a full committee, but making sure that we're empowering them to do things. So people keep coming back because they feel like they're contributing to the actual event success. And so that's the second piece. And then the third one is at all committee meetings, they need to be led by your volunteers because peer-to-peer messaging is so much stronger and much more effective. And I think that's why the relay model is such a great example, because you have those volunteer leaders leading their committees and really holding their volunteers accountable for the work that needs to happen in between meetings. And I think that's another key to the success of the relay model for sure.
All right, and this next slide, we wanted to show you the extent to which our volunteer committees are empowered. So Danielle, if you'll address this.
So what you see on the screen is just a sample of some guidelines in terms of some benchmarks and that where committees can really own this from the very beginning when the event chairperson is confirmed to filling the roles, to what happens at those committee meetings and what the focus needs to be to keep those events on track. Again, the staff are really the experts when it comes to the logistics of the timelines and the benchmarks, but really the volunteers are the ones that need to own them and put them into work. And so by providing this template, you have a chance to really give the volunteers tools that they can then leap from and really accomplish what's needed to have their events stay on track and on track to goal. And I think that's a really key piece to this. So it, again, doesn't have to be complicated for the volunteers to take and really own, and I think goal setting is also part of this in your future volunteer interactions.
So Danielle, can you talk about what happens year to year with this volunteer committee? What's the dynamic over time?
So we talked a little bit at the beginning in the onset of the loyalty of relay volunteers, and throughout my career, that was the one thing that really struck with me, is that the longevity of relay volunteers is very significant. And so with that, you start to see some patterns. In the nonprofit space, there's always going to be turnover at the frontline staff. It's just the nature of some of the business. But when you think about how relay has been able to stay on track and be so successful over all these years, the strength of these volunteer committees and the longevity of the volunteers keep things moving when we do experience turnover. And so that's one of the added benefits to having that volunteer committee is, first, it allows the events and the mission to keep moving forward. The second thing it does, volunteers bring in new networks. And I think that the key to that piece is that you have these long-term volunteers that are always bringing in new volunteers. And they talk about relay whenever they have the chance, it seems. And so that's bringing in new ideas, new blood to the relay model, and really that allows for the sustainability that relay has experienced over the 30-year time period, because you have a vested interest of the long-term volunteers that really care about the core of the mission, and then you have these new volunteers from school and from college that are starting out, that are looking to build that affinity, and they've been able to join these long-lasting committees that kind of keep the relay model moving even in the experience of turnover. And I think that's a really key piece with any volunteer model, one of the benefits for sure.
All right, and then I guess ultimately what we're after is a resulting financial goal being met.
So I think this is obviously the money needs to follow the people, right? And so when you look at the networks that our volunteers have, they're pretty substantial. And so with that, they start to talk about, you know, when you think about how you joined an event, someone asked you to join, and usually it's a peer or a family member. When you tap into those networks of our volunteers and them using their networks to help us reach our goals, that's really the key to a successful fundraising and sustainable fundraising platform, because you're leveraging people's connections to fundraise. And for any organization, that can definitely help the bottom line.
Excellent. You know, Danielle, as you were talking, it was kind of funny because when my first experience with nonprofit, which was, you know, many years ago, the staff person who was there at the Relay for Life at which I volunteered, I would ask a question of the staff person, and the volunteer chair would stick her head in and answer it because she had more organizational knowledge than the staff person, which I found to be true often in the Relay world because they are so long-lived. All right, at this point, we're going to do another poll. I love these things. They're so much fun. Okay, so let's poll the audience on how big is your volunteer committee for your event. If you could take a look and start voting. 15%, 35%, 50%. You guys are great at this. All right, we're at about 80%. I'm going to close the poll and publish it back to you. And what we see is that 25 people to 20 people seems to cover the majority of our audience. So I want you to keep those numbers in mind as we move forward, because we're going to get into the science portion now. A lot of what Danielle has talked about can actually be, you can round out your information base with the science behind it, both with data and with social science, which is where we're going now. So one small piece of data, this is something that I have asked for of every client I've had over the last 27 years, and that is, you know, do you track your volunteer leadership committee against fundraising? Meaning, is there a part of your database that on each individual fundraiser you mark whether they're on the leadership committee or not? And by leadership committee, I mean even if you parked cars, I'd like to know about that. So nobody tracks that, but we did get one client to actually give us the information we needed to come up with a statistic, and what we found predictably is that a large amount of the event income comes from teams and individuals associated with the event. And that was the Hydrocephalus Association. So what we found, again, when we did that data set, is that it was very predictable. Unfortunately, no one tracks that, and there is reason to believe that serving on a volunteer leadership committee is actually causal to fundraising as opposed to simply a marker of high affinity and high fundraising. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Otis Fulton. He's our staff psychologist, and he's going to give us a little bit of science to work with. And as he does this, I may jump in, and actually Danielle and Becky may as well, to sort of help you connect the dots from the science to peer-to-peer fundraising and volunteer leadership. So Otis?
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, okay. Well, you know, nonprofits tap people's social networks. And so what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is how big are people's social networks? You know, it turns out that we really have a pretty good answer to the size and composition of people's social networks. I want to talk about how do we see ourselves in relation to our social networks, and then also what really motivates people. And I'll give you a hint, it's not money. I don't know if you've read this book by Daniel Pink. He's an economist, but he identified some common factors that led to fulfillment at home, work, and everywhere. And I think that there's some really good information that we can glean from what he found out about what really motivates people. Next. So allow me to be a college professor for just a couple of minutes. I promise I'll get to the more useful stuff, but this is kind of the interesting part. 98% of our ancestors lived on the African savanna, and that's where our brains evolved to both survive and thrive. And a lot of people think that humans evolved because they developed abstract thinking. That's not the common thinking now of psychology. What we think is the biggest factor that determined whether an individual survived or not was how he was related to his social group. And the bottom line is that humans are just hardwired for sociability. There was a recent study that I was looking at the other day. It said that 70% of the content of our day-to-day conversations are social in nature, how we relate to other people and how they relate to us. So, it's interesting. We all work in our organizations with social networks, but what is the size, the average size of a person's social network? It's kind of an interesting question. In the 1990s, an Oxford psychologist named Robin Dunbar kind of stumbled upon a way to calculate this by mistake. He was looking at actually how primates groom themselves, and he looked at the size of the brain and the size of their social groups and so forth, and came up with a formula to calculate the average size of a human social group. And it turns out that the number of people that we can maintain in a stable social relationships with is right around 150. And there's some variance. That's an average. It's somewhere between 100 and 200, but 150 turns out to be a pretty solid average. In other words, we know who these people are, and we know how they're related to each other. And, we treat people in our social in-group in a special way. We are really hardwired to support each other. And that's why peer-to-peer is such an effective strategy. We support, and interestingly, we support the members of our social group even if we don't particularly like that individual. So let's say we've got, crotchety Aunt Mary. She never says anything good about anybody in the family. She doesn't vote the same way that we do, and yet if she asks us for a favor, we almost always comply with her. We're just hardwired. And a while back there was some reading that was done rather on altruism genes. It's kind of uncertain yet if there is such a thing as an altruism gene. But one thing that we do know is people are hardwired to enjoy being altruistic. So it makes it very easy to tap into these social networks. And so what is it that motivates us? The next one?
Actually, Otis, before you go on, I wanted to jump back to something that Danielle said, which was, volunteer leadership is important because of their connection to the community. So when you do the math on this, if a staff person is controlling the event, their connection to the community is how big? 150 people? As compared to our survey responses, there are 28% of you have 20 or more volunteers on your committee, and that's 3,000 touches, 3,000 hooks into the community. And I think that's part of the math of this thing that's so powerful about volunteer leadership. It's not just that we're able to get more work done, it's that we have more relationships with the community when we have a fully built out volunteer committee. And this is the science behind it. So I'll take you back.
Absolutely. Just let me make a mention of that. Dunbar's, this research is called Dunbar's number. 150 is the one that's really mostly known, but there are some other ones. We also work we have social networks in groups of 50, and we consider those people our close friends. We see them regularly. And then there's 15. These are our confidants, the people that you turn to for support. So, it was very interesting when we put the poll up and we saw the volunteer committee members in the 10 to 15 range. That's exactly what we'd expect, and that's exactly the size that you can expect to be very supportive of one another. Okay, next one. So, what motivates us to work and do things within these groups that we identify with? Psychologists talk about two types of motivation: extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is simply, I'm working to get something that's provided for me. We're all extrinsically motivated in terms of our paycheck. Extrinsic motivation works pretty well, especially for one-off situations. So if you have someone you want them to come in and park cars on Saturday, you can offer some tickets to a concert or a ball game. It's a very transactional in nature. But more effective is really intrinsic motivation. People are doing things because they identify with the greater good. It's consistent with their belief system or their attitudes. And so what we want to do is develop this intrinsic motivation. Next one. And how do we do that? Psychologists talk about self-labels. This is the way that I see myself. There are a number of attributes, and I'm going to give you an example. We talk about nouns, not verbs, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. There's a large group of research around this idea. I'll give you a very simple example. If you can get someone to say, "I'm a chocolate lover," as opposed to say, "I'm someone who loves to eat chocolate," the person who says, "I self-identifies as a chocolate lover," has a much higher liking for chocolate than the person who just says, "I love to eat chocolate." And that generalizes to all kinds of things. Take me, for example. I support 3 or 4 nonprofits. They're the Humane Society, ASPCA, and Animal Sanctuary. I self-identify, my self-label, I'm an animal advocate. And I will independently go out and seek out ways to further that cause because it's consistent with the kinds of beliefs and attitudes that I have. Excellent. So, what's the role, what's the purpose of incentives? And I don't even, at Turnkey they talk a lot about recognition as opposed to incentives, and I really like that. The purpose of giving people things, touching people, is really to strengthen this self-label, because we know the self-label then will strengthen their sense of intrinsic motivation and have them do more things for your benefit. And, the first one we got up here is somebody hugging. People just crave social feedback. It's almost embarrassing how much people crave social feedback. And I think that that's something that's really underestimated in most of our corporate world today. You've got the Relay for Life wristband there. There's something called insufficient justification in psychology. I don't want to get too deeply into it so I can talk about it for half an hour. But whenever we give anything to anyone as a thank you, we never want that thing to be justification for them working for you. So just give you an example. Person comes in and works all weekend, they get an iPad. Okay, it's something that everyone knows costs about $400. There's an unconscious math that will take place, and then they say, "I just worked 24 hours for a $400. I just worked for X dollars per hour. Is it worth it?" It puts it into a transaction rather than something that I really believe in doing because it's consistent with my internal label. And we got the microphone here. Katrina talked about people taking a leadership role. Give people the microphone. Let them self-identify to other people as someone who's really invested in that mission. That's, again, another way to really reinforce this idea that I'm connected to this and I'm doing this because I believe in it, not something that I'm getting from the outside. It's not extrinsically motivated. Katrina?
But
and
intrinsically motivated.
Yes.
Go ahead, Otis.
Exactly. I'm a frequent flyer. I'm a 2 million miler on Delta, and I used to see Sky Mall magazine all the time. In fact, I'm so disappointed they did away with it because I did all my Christmas shopping between Los Angeles and New York last year, so on that flight. I was on a redemption site for a nonprofit organization. It looked very much like Sky Mall magazine. All of a sudden, there was all this merchandise on it and so forth. And that's really, again, giving people things that they can value in dollars and cents really hurts their self-label and is the type of thing that you really want to avoid. There have been studies of lawyers, for example. I don't want to pick on lawyers. My dad was a lawyer. But people that bill hourly, they have this unconscious there's this unconscious calculation that takes place even when they're not working. I'm taking my kids to a ball game for 3 hours. That's a $500 engagement. So it's a very pernicious kind of thing when you start to give folks these kinds of thank you gifts. They will accept them because they kind of see them as family income. It's something that they can't not take, but it really puts them into an extrinsic relationship with the organization rather than being intrinsically motivated to do things for the right reason. And I just want to touch on Daniel Pink. We were talking about the composition of the volunteer groups and so forth. Daniel Pink, if you haven't read Drive, it's a wonderful book. I recommend it highly. Daniel Pink's an economist, and he identified these three factors for satisfaction in work and home and so forth. The first is autonomy. People really have the desire to be self-directed. And the reason that is the case, it very clearly communicates to them, if they are autonomous, that you trust in them to deliver for you. And I think that everybody's probably had the experience along the way, I certainly have, of being micromanaged by somebody in an organization. And if you think about it, it really communicates that I don't trust you. I don't trust you enough to be autonomous. The second piece is what Daniel Pink calls mastery. I like to call it competence. It's the desire to get better at something important. It's really developing yourself. And how is it that you know that you've achieved a level of competence? It's when somebody recognizes you for it often. Katrina, do you want to make mention of that?
Yeah. Well, again, we seek data whenever we can to support the social science. And the analogy that we're drawing here is between fundraisers and volunteer leadership. Fundraisers who seek recognition of their competence in fundraising raise 37% more than fundraisers who don't care about that recognition of their competence. And then just for fun, we like to look at it over time. And what we found is that of the people who seek recognition for their competence in year one, in year two, they raise 284% more than people who do not seek recognition for their competence. So I think if you draw the analogy to volunteer leadership, what that says is greater engagement, acceptance of ever higher level tasks and responsibilities, and higher retention of the volunteer leadership to the next year if we can recognize their competence, which, the examples that Danielle gave us did so brilliantly. They offered them a hierarchy through which to prove ever-increasing competence in the relay world. They offered them, they never offered them things that were likely to be mistaken for pay. They was always about their true competence as leaders. So I think this data supports that idea. It just shows it in a different audience, which is the fundraiser versus the volunteer leader.
Yeah, research tells us that we are so hardwired to be rewarded by social feedback. Even feedback from complete strangers has the same effect as people we know. And the third part of Daniel Pink's trifecta is being part of something bigger. That what we do produces something transcendent. It serves something beyond ourselves. And what does this sound like? Yeah. What that sounds like to me is that we want to benefit our social group. We know that, again, we're hardwired that way. So again, that gets back to this idea that it's very important to nurture the person's self-label to make them feel connected to our organizations. And we know the people who are connected to the kinds of organizations that you all represent are just happier people. So sometimes I'll get the comment, boy, it seems a little bit Machiavellian or manipulative, but I see this as the opportunity, as really providing people with an opportunity to very much enrich their lives, because there's a lot of research out there that says that this is what makes people really happy and fulfilled.
So the next part of our conversation with Danielle, I credit her. She had this wonderful relay experience building volunteer leadership and increasing organizational capacity, and then she brought it to MDA. But it wasn't as easy, and she agreed to talk to us about that. And I think it's, it's always nice when you have unicorns and butterflies, but sometimes it's just slogging through the mud, and she's willing to talk to us about that. So Danielle, I'll ask you to start telling us about your MDA experience, what has happened so far, what your plans are for the future.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Otis, for sharing that. And I think the science definitely does marry to the social piece of the conversation for sure. So as Katrina mentioned, when I joined MDA, we had a very staff-driven walk program. And so one of the first things that we had all looked at, current MDA employees and myself, was an opportunity to really introduce a more volunteer-driven model to our walk program that could really tap into those community networks that would really leave us a solid footing as a community event. And so really wanting to make sure that we started that way. And it started with gaining the buy-in from the leadership. And I would say that for organizations that are kind of thinking about this and where to start, that's the first key. And I think, you know, having ongoing conversations with field leadership about the volunteer initiatives and what our staff roles are going to be key, because what we message to our staff is actually what's going to be executed. And so I think that messaging from the leadership and buy-in from the leadership is critical for a volunteer program to be successful. The second thing I think we learned is that when we transition from our staff-led to volunteer-driven events, we need to start small. In our first year, we chose a pilot of 15 events. And I think that when we look back on it, I think we wish we would have chosen 10 because I think we could have spent a little bit more time with the 10 and making them really great and really learning from them and really helping the staff to be successful in the training of the volunteers and the execution of those events. And so start small, I think, is definitely a lesson learned this year. The third thing I think we learned is that staff are sometimes reluctant to transition the following pieces. The responsibility, and what I mean by that is we're holding our staff accountable for the bottom line goals, and so currently they are in control of reaching those bottom line goals. And so transferring that responsibility to a volunteer who may or may not come through for them is a little scary sometimes. Past relationships. Our staff have worked very hard to develop long-term relationships. It's one of the backbones of MDA, I would say, is very strong relationships. And so there's a reluctance to give those up or transition them to volunteers because you want to take care of them. We want them to keep going. So there's that piece to it too. And the last thing is, and I don't think MDA is the only nonprofit that operates, that recruitment on benchmark is important to keep us on track. So what if the volunteers don't deliver the same numbers that we need on a weekly basis? And so from the Relay experience, you know, those networks allow us to tap into and meet our recruitment goals sometimes faster than we ever could on our own. But again, there's that natural transition that's it's got to happen, and it's going to take a little bit of time. The other thing we learned is that our day of event duties, staff were okay with transitioning, and so maybe an introductory point to a volunteer transition program is really what is the easiest to part with. And for our staff, one of the things we learned was day of event was comfortable for them. They felt like volunteers could do a great job in thinking about what day of event looked like and executing. And so that's one piece that we're adapting for this year as we bring on some additional events to transition, is what does that day of event component look like so that we can get those events comfortable with that first step.
So Danielle, I want to ask you a question here. When you think about what Otis just talked about, and that autonomy is such an important part of this, and mastery, it almost feels like you're going in the other direction, because day of duties are tasks. You get assigned to do something, told when to do it, told where to do it, and then you're done. So it doesn't really inspire that. What are your thoughts around that?
So I think that's one way to look at it, but I think that the way that we've chosen to look at it is day of event can be an experience all its own. Just like the recruitment of those teams and what we do leading up to your events is also an experience that we create for them. So if volunteers can really own that day of event from the start to finish, and welcoming the folks to deciding what the schedule of events looks like, to how things are laid out, and it still allows them to have that autonomy and mastery of the day of event and really own it, but just in a different way. And I think for us, we learned that that's a valuable first step to making our transition.
So when you say day of events, you mean actually planning the day, the logistics around it.
Exactly, logistics, entertainment, you bet, everything for that day of event. I think is a really key piece. So, and they go in with a blank piece of paper, and the volunteers really get to, from start to finish, plan what that day of event can be.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, and just let me throw in it. If I could just throw in just one other suggestion too. You know, sometimes we need people to do exactly what we say. I mean, there are some roles that really demand that. One thing that you will find will be useful, though, is giving people a choice whether or not to do that, or giving them a choice of roles. If they choose to be in a very scripted role, their satisfaction is going to be much higher than if they're just placed in a role. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so offering a menu of opportunities.
A menu.
Okay, very good. Danielle?
So what were the lessons learned in year one? And so the first thing I can share with all of you is that our staff are excited about a different way or a new way of doing things when it comes to our walk program. And they see the potential for this. And so I think if we didn't have that, I think that we would be wondering, okay, what are our next steps? But the fact that our staff are excited and behind it, they also see there's an opportunity for them to open up a different skill set than they might currently be using. And so therefore, it's an investment in them and their career development. I think that's a key piece to this. We have to acknowledge that there's a genuine fear of there's a loss of control or of failure if the volunteers don't come through. And we as the leadership need to make sure that we're supporting and getting our staff comfortable in how to manage volunteers so that it's not about control or failure, it's about working in partnership with the volunteers to drive outcomes for the organization. And when we drive them together, we are so much stronger than just being a staff-driven organization. And we see that with some of our other priority programs. And so I think being able to kind of learn from those other priority programs and really acknowledging what that fear is and then being able to work through it with the staff, I think in our second year we'll have a much stronger outcome with our volunteer events. The third thing, and I think I learned this early in my American Cancer Society career as well, that holding volunteers accountable is hard. And those critical conversations, they can be uncomfortable. And so how do we prepare our staff better to have those conversations, to manage volunteer activities in working with that event chairperson and making sure that we've put the right person in that event chair role to hold the other volunteers accountable so that we do stay in line with the timeline that we need to accomplish things. And so, you know, I think one thing I've learned in this first year is that we've got to do a healthier job in helping our staff kind of work through what does it look like to hold volunteers accountable and making sure that they're okay, that it doesn't have to be overwhelming for it to be work, or it doesn't have to be a really strong conversation, that you're both there for the same reason. The volunteer has the same passions that you do in a lot of ways, and so how do you kind of meet in the middle and work through those trouble spots? And not wait too long. I think that's the other piece, is we can't ignore it. If it's not working, we've got to kind of get to the root of it and deal with it. And I think, you know, for our staff that have been able to do that, they've done it, and the volunteers have really excelled after those conversations. So, but we need to, as leadership, really help them through that. The fourth thing is that all of our metrics are actually tied to our income and our teams and our participants, but we really have not established what that volunteer leadership, those volunteer leadership metrics need to be. We have a committee structure, but how do we really hold staff accountable to work through the committee to accomplish those metrics? And I think that's something that we need to kind of really learn from in our first year and as we tackle our second year. And then the last thing is, and I think this was a big surprise, and it probably doesn't surprise many of you on the phone that work with volunteers often, but the investment of time to get volunteers recruited and trained is pretty significant when you think of it, especially if it's the staff are learning it as the volunteers are being recruited. So is it worth it in the end? And really we have to be able to kind of draw out those Relay for Life examples and say, absolutely it's worth it, because this could be the return on our investment when we make that investment in the volunteers and training them to do the roles that we're recruiting them for and letting them go and accomplish great things on behalf of the organization. And so I would say that's another key learning point that we've learned in this past year. So next step, I mentioned, oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
So the next steps for us, as I mentioned, I think I've learned a lot through this process, and I know the other leadership involved with the program, we've learned a lot about our volunteer initiative. But one of the things that we had to do as a next step is really take a step back. And so, Katrina, if it's okay, I'm going to share this coach versus player analogy because I think it was a light bulb moment for our managers and for our event staff. So we might have some Dallas Cowboy fans on the line, but we might also have our other teams that you support, but the analogy still stays the same. So Jerry Jones is the owner of the Cowboys, and his role is critical as owner and president in making sure he has the right personnel hired to put together a winning team in a winning season and be a contender year after year. And so their goal is either to win a championship every year or to keep improving and getting to those subsequent championships in future years. And so his role is really to hire the right people. So he, in turn, hired a great person in his son who really is his personnel decision maker. And his son is the one that decides on the head coach with his father. And I liken this to the nonprofit world, and Jerry Jones and his son really are the equivalent to our event manager and the overall managers, leaders. And so the critical piece of that is they needed to find the right coach for the Dallas Cowboys to be a contender. And so they went out and they hired a great coach, and he's been there for a few years, and they've been in contention. The key piece to that, and where it makes the analogy work, is that the coach in our case is actually our event chair. He's responsible for making sure the players are in the right position, that they are conditioned for not only that game but the entire season. He's making sure that they're accountable for the positions and the delivery of the points, or keeping the offense on the field or off the field. That coach is critical to their success. And when the coach doesn't get it done, then it's time to make a change on behalf of the organization. And it seems like a harsh way to talk about volunteers, but the reality is our volunteer leaders are that critical for our events to move forward. And so when it comes to MDA, we need to make sure we're getting the right level of leaders recruited to lead our events that are passionate, that they understand the role of being an event chairperson, that can drive outcomes and goals, and really willing to tap into their community network to make our mission, to enhance our mission. And really, I think that's the Cowboys example I would give you, is that they're able to accomplish that because the three work in conjunction with each other, the staff and Jason as the coach. Internally at MDA, we have the management team and we have an event leader. Now it's about getting the right coach to make sure the players are all in the right positions and in contention to lead the walk program forward. Does that
Danielle,
make sense?
do you think that it does? And I'm curious, do you think that HR is on board with this? Do they understand that they're hiring coaches now and not event managers?
Yes, it's definitely been part of our culture change, and I would say that we know that we can move our mission faster when we bring in volunteers, and so there's definitely, it's not just with our walk program. Many of our other programs currently use volunteers, and so it's making sure that we're building the skill set with our staff and giving them the tools to do the role of a relationship manager and a volunteer manager versus an event staff manager only.
Very good. Excellent.
And Danielle, let me just say, that given the state of the Dallas Cowboys season this year, I know that you have a very strong self-label as a Dallas Cowboy fan.
Oh, I'm not a Dallas Cowboys fan. I'm an Iowa Hawkeye fan, but okay. I just use the Dallas Cowboys because their owner is present all the time, so he's one that stood out in my mind.
That's a good reason too. Okay.
But I appreciate all of you Dallas Cowboy fans that are on.
All right. Okay, so the next part of this is we, at Turnkey, we're supporting organizations in building their volunteer leadership infrastructure. And one of our consultants that we place is Becky Lenders. Becky is enviably has a really nice background. She's got a couple of stories to share with us. Becky was with the American Cancer Society Relay for Life, and then she's going to share with us, I think, your experience. Becky, are you on with me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Your experience at American Cancer, I think Danielle probably covered, but if you could give us those other two stories and what your experiences were there, that would be great.
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. I worked at ACS with Relay for Life for about 9 years, and then for the last about 9 years, I've been working in a consulting capacity to really share that model of volunteer-driven, staff-supported events. And I've got a couple different clients that I've worked with over the last several years. One that it wasn't a bad experience working with them, but it was a bad experience as far as the embracement of the culture of volunteer-driven leadership. With that client, they had events that were very staff-driven in the past, very hands-on. You know, when the event came, everyone in that office, as far as staff, mobilized, and they'd give a few tasks to volunteers. So transitioning that organization to a volunteer-driven, staff-supported event was a bit of a challenge. The staff was not ready to let go and let those volunteers for all the reasons that Danielle mentioned. But what we did learn in that experience was, you know, we were trying to get volunteer committees to really own what was a walk event, and what we realized is the manual was just that. It was a manual. It was about a 2-inch wide binder that had all the tasks, and it was a very well done manual, but it did not make it easy for staff to divide up the roles. So what we ended up doing is creating actual volunteer handbooks so the staff could easily delegate the different positions on the committee to a volunteer chairperson, and really spelled it out on then how did that volunteer chairperson delegate the individual pieces of that area of the event to their volunteer subcommittee. So in introducing those tools started to turn the tide where volunteers were able to embrace it, and the staff was a little easier to let go because they had a tool to do that. So it's a work in progress, but I'm confident that some of the volunteers have now experienced what it means to lead an event for all of those reasons that Otis spelled out, and they're excited about the potential. Now we've got the tools to go with that. On the flip side of that, I had another client who established a walk event, and we started from the ground up with strategy, building out those committees. Inherently, the organization doesn't have a lot of development folks in the field, so they rely on volunteers, and for them it was, you want one of these events in your community, show us that you've got a committee of 10 or 12 people that can really take this and make it happen. The staff is still there supporting them, but not as prevalent as other organizations where the staff is actually in charge of the actual event and having trouble letting go. So in this circumstance, the volunteers really took it and ran with it. We had those individual volunteer handbooks. We broke up all of the responsibilities so they could really just embrace it, build a committee, and power through, and they saw incredible growth from year 1 to year 2, and have even more growth planned for year 3. So 2 different examples. I think that the keys are training staff so that they know what it means to delegate, to go from being a doer to a delegator, create the tools that you need to actually hand things off to the volunteers so that staff aren't spending ungodly hours copying pieces of books and making handbooks. You can do that on a centralized avenue. And then providing volunteer management, whether it's coaching or training or webinars, to really help those staff learn what it means to be a volunteer manager versus an event planner, because everyone loves to plan a birthday party, and in a lot of cases walks and events are just that, planning birthday parties. But in order to see that explosive growth and that sustainability that Relay for Life has experienced over the years, we really have to move to these volunteer-driven models where the volunteers can power things through and continue to grow despite turnover that you might have within the organization. So that's my 2-minute spiel on volunteer management, and I love helping organizations realize the potential and build the steps to get there.
All right, thank you, Becky. You know, one of the biggest things that we hear from people is that the staff person who considers themselves the event manager has a really hard time transitioning to this other idea of being a volunteer manager. And Otis is going to talk a little bit about what's going on in that staff person's head, what they're experiencing psychologically, and potentially what you can do about it.
Yeah, and I'll be brief in the just to save time here, but you know, I talked earlier about our brains were adapted to the savannah, and here we are. We're in conference rooms right now, so we're taking a savannah brain and putting it into a very different environment. And some of the things that we know that we are biased in terms of decision making. Making decisions are easy. You know, it turns out that changing our minds is really what's hard, and there are some evolutionary pressures that are involved in that. What is called loss aversion. It turns out that the pleasure of a gain is only half that of the pain of a loss. I'll say it the other way. If somebody gives you $10, okay, you experience a certain amount of satisfaction. But if you lose $10, the pain is double that. The pain of the loss is double that of the pleasure of the gain. And so what that does is it makes us very, very conservative in trying new things. And so that, you know, that the old adage, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And, you know, evolutionary biologists think about this as, you know, the people that were very conservative about what they had were very survived better than the people that went out in the savannah and tried to get new things, because there were lions out there, quite honestly. It was very dangerous to do that. So, you know, our brains are wired to be conservative in this way, and it's totally unconscious. And then, you know, the other one that really makes it, yes, go ahead.
So Otis, to draw the analogy to the event staff person, if I'm a new event staff person and my income goal is $75,000, that's what I'm trying to avoid losing, right? And I'm defaulting to behaviors that I perceive are more likely to help me avoid that loss.
That's exactly right. You know, we are programmed to be very, very conservative in all of those kinds of decisions. Exactly.
All right.
Let's go to the other one. And then, you know, the other one, kind of the granddaddy of them all, is you know, what's called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias refers, it's our tendency to search for information that confirms our existing beliefs, you know, no matter how goofy or maladaptive they may be. And so you've got all this information out there. Your mind is unconsciously sifting the information to confirm what we already believe. We kind of tend to think that we form a hypothesis about something and look at all the information and so forth, and then either decide if it's correct or incorrect, when actually that's not at all what happens. What we do is we latch onto a belief, sometimes with very little information at hand, and we choose the information that confirms our existing belief, and we tend to discard the information that disconfirms our belief. And, you know, we see that all the time today in political parties, people just talking by each other rather than really engaging in discourse. That's the best example of that I can give. But it makes having informed decisions very difficult, because it makes it very, very difficult for us to change.
Very good. All right. Thank you all for joining us. This is where you can get help. You can't have Danielle, but you can get help from us. Turnkey's offering volunteer leadership build-out with Becky as our primary person, motivation and recognition programs, and staff leadership training around the psychology of it. If you have specific questions, whether you are interested in engagement or not, we'd love to hear from you. Either Otis or I can help you out, and these are our email addresses. The next webinar that we have scheduled is December 15th. We're going to have Amy Braderman with us from Blackbaud, and what we'll be talking about is how to position the Blackbaud suite of tools to best make use of human psychological impulses. You know, what can you do with your Blackbaud tool that will really speak to human beings in the way that we need to in order to get them to do what we want, which is to ask other people for money. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Happy Thanksgiving.